Hi, great. Thank you very much indeed for our participants here with us for making those presentations and taking the time to think them through and put them together. We're tremendously grateful. We're now going to move to question and answer. So if participants have any questions they'd like to pose, any burning issues they'd like to hear addressed, then please do post them in the Q&A. While you think about that, I just wondered if I might actually ask a question or two myself. Think of Ina's presentation, one of the nearly the last or 2 or 3 slides from the end at least. You were addressing making informed decisions. I wondered, we hear a lot about informed decisions and making informed decisions, and that they're important things to do. I just wondered if all three of you might like to reflect on the question, how do we know an informed decision when we see it? And can we characterize the expectations sufficiently to help us design a governance model?
So maybe I can start with just a few reflections on informed decision making. I think for me, at least, there are two aspects to this. Like, what is an informed decision making? What is an informed decision? On the one hand, we want decisions to be based on the best available knowledge that's out there. So it's sort of based on scientific evaluation, scientific research, scientific information that we have. So to gather the knowledge that we have, put that together and make a decision based on the best available research. But research is not everything, especially not if it's only natural science research. So on the other hand, I think it's also really important to think about whose interests are represented. How do we sort of how do we get different perspectives at the table? That means also engaging in political debates and discussions, and that means engaging with people who might have different opinions on this. And trying to then integrate these different ideas and perspectives into the decision that is made. It's part of the political process. And I think engaging in debate and discussion is a really important part of also making an informed decision. So that's just sort of my take on these two important elements, but maybe Arunabha or Douglas have additional ideas on what should be involved.
So first of all, Paul, when we talk about prior informed consent, right, and that is a principle that is often used in many other areas. You want to build a dam, you need to get prior informed consent. You want to build a nuclear power plant, you need to get prior informed consent. So this issue always comes up, how much information is sufficient? So number one principle is whatever information you do have, you have to provide. And often that becomes problematic when you frame the, I mean, I really liked Ina's, problem definition framing issue, because the way you're framing it then determines what is the kind of quantum of information that you're supposed to be providing, right? So that's one thing. The second is that you have to also outline very clearly what you don't know, right? So it's as much matters what you do know and you're informing. You also have to inform what you don't know. So think about going into surgery and you're, say, more than 80 years old, right? The doctor has to tell you, well, there's a 50% chance or a 60% chance that his surgery will be successful. But because you're over 80, there's also going to be a range of other implications that we can't completely say with certainty or any reasonable degree of certainty how it might impact. And you, as the sort of receiver of that message, have to then decide, how much of that information is sufficient for you to say yes to the surgery or not. So the point is, we always think about prior informed consent as a supply side story. No, it is entirely about the recipients of that information. Public consultations can be either a unidirectional supply of information from a project proponent, or it could be a reverse directional asking of questions. But a genuine public consultation is a bi-directional conversation. So what works today or does not work today might work day after tomorrow. And then you could go back and say, well, you said no that time round, and now you're saying yes. Yes, that's exactly how public consultations work. So SAI is no different than how it has been practiced in many other areas, whether you're looking at pharmaceutical research, whether you're looking at big infrastructure building. That's how I would look at it. The process legitimacy is far more important than the actual quantum of information shared or not.
I would agree with both of those comments. I think the one additional thing I might just add is just to remember that, you know, whether it's SAI or in principle any other context, the decision is always, you know, the context matters, right? It's not just should we build this dam, it's what happens if we don't build the dam. Like where else are we going to get our electricity from is an important question. And the same sort of thing with geoengineering. And this sort of goes back to some of Ina's framing as well, right? Is the alternative a warmer world? Is the alternative that we should be putting more effort into mitigation? And that question of framing is an important piece of it as well. So if you simply frame it as this is independent from a decision about emissions, then you're going to say, well, what would happen if we don't do this? Then we get more and more climate damages. Whereas if you frame it as what is our most economical approach to managing climate change? Should we be cutting emissions or should we be doing this? Then you'd reach a different conclusion. So you have to understand what the broader context is, what the alternatives are.
Okay, thank you very much. Just a brief reflection before I go into the question that's been received. This idea of informed consent, it clearly works in relation to a patient, an individual patient, the 80-year-old, or a community who are exploring whether to have a dam built or not. In the context of SAI, does it matter that this is a global intervention? And you're beginning to open up questions about this being can you have a democratic process, a democratic conversation that takes you to an informed consent for the entire global population, or is that something we simply can't expect to move towards and wouldn't be worth pursuing? I don't know.
I think there is nothing that it's going to be entirely global without relative gains and losses for different regions. And again, it's the framing of the question that will matter, right? Doug, in his presentation, had that example of cirrus clouds thinning and that Australia is thinking about that as a regional intervention to look at the Great Barrier Reef. Or was it that technology, or was it a different technology?
That was for marine cloud brightening.
Marine cloud brightening, sorry about that. But the point is, and I said it in my presentation as well, that if this is a first resort, right, that, you know, we are not doing much under the Paris Agreement, let's all come together and let's start all working on stratospheric aerosol injection, then it's a global conversation. But any particular, say, territory which says, you know, I'm sinking and I'm likely to sink in the next 5 years, it's an existential crisis for me now. It's an existential crisis for the planet over the course of the next 30 years or 40 years. I might not wait for a global conversation around it. So again, it depends on what are you responding to, first resort or last resort. Is a signal to get people to the table and discuss, as Doug put it, the risk analysis of acting on SAI or not acting on climate change. It all again matters on how you're framing the question. If an asteroid were hitting the planet, right, and it's not big enough to completely destroy the planet, but it's big enough to cause some severe damage, right? Would we have a global coalition of actors trying to send up a rocket to blow up the asteroid? Or would we say, well, that's a problem for wherever in the South Pacific it's going to go and hit? You know, so it always depends on the relative gains and losses.
So maybe I can add on to that a little bit. I think when it comes to SAI in particular, I think there are two ways, well, two possibilities that I see that could develop. There's probably more, but one way of seeing it is that SAI becomes a sort of a dedicated intervention, that it becomes like a first event followed by a second event and so forth. And there's dedicated actors who are going to start deploying SAI at a global scale, sort of on behalf of the global population. Even maybe if it's just for their own region, if the country is big enough, they could try and do it at a more localized scale. I'm not sure if that's even possible because it sort of distributes around the world. So that is like one scenario where you have this one-off, like you have dedicated actors who are going to start an intervention, and that looks very much like a global experiment because we don't know exactly what's going to happen. And I think their actors have a very good reason. Everybody else who's not involved in the deployment has a very good reason to be asked for prior informed consent. Because whatever happens with this intervention is going to affect actors all over the world. And therefore, I'm not sure whether an actor could go forward and do this without encountering significant pushback from other countries. And I also think that an actor who would do this or would be able to do this over a long enough period of time in order to have that effect that we want, the sort of more permanent keeping temperature down, would have to be a rather powerful actor. So even say there are small island developing states that are on existential threat, the question is whether they would be actually able to do this at a long enough period of time, or whether they would then be working together with a more powerful actor who has maybe less climate credit, but more of a sort of the industrial and military power to deal with this. In any case, the effect would be global, and there I think actors would intervene and say, listen, you did this, you cannot do this without our prior agreement. That is one scenario that I see. On the other hand, maybe it won't be the stratospheric aerosol in that form, in that sort of like one-off event and one big actor sort of doing this, but there could be other ways that using reflection, using solar radiation modification in other forms and ways might become a more creeping process in which a large amount of different actors that are not nations, but maybe private companies could start using this as a way to offset their climate, so their greenhouse gas emissions. And we see this happening right now in the International Organization for Standardization, that there's an initiative to bring forward a sort of radiative forcing footprint that could be integrated into carbon markets, and with which all sorts of actors could essentially offset their greenhouse gas emissions. And that, I think, that would be a different kind of process in which it's not a one-off event, but sort of a much smaller amount of steps where this prior informed consent wouldn't be asked for because it would just kind of develop by itself.
Okay. Thank you very much. Framing is everything is always a good answer to all questions in the social sciences, but it's very true. So I'm going to go to the question that we have before us. I think it's probably Doug to answer this one. Did anyone state how much injection in terms of stratospheric aerosol injection might be needed for a specific amount of reduction in solar radiation or in effect cooling?
So ballpark, 1% reduction in sunlight hitting the planet would be enough to offset about 2% reduction would be offset all of the warming from a 2 times CO2. So a 1% reduction would be enough to offset the global mean temperature changes from all of the CO2 we've put into the atmosphere since pre-industrial. So we're not talking about a big total percentage. And so if the concern is, say, overall photosynthesis on the planet, that is a relatively small effect compared to, compared to the bigger levers we're moving. So adding CO2 and altering temperature and precipitation patterns and things like that.
I wonder if you could turn that into, express it in a different way for us as well, rather than percentages for return against warming. Are you able to express that in terms of tons of material that would require injection per degree of warming? Yeah,
so about ballpark would be like 10 teragrams, not a unit you're typically used to using, 10 megatons of sulfur dioxide would offset about 1 degree of, would cool the planet by about 1 degree Celsius. And so for context, we currently dump about 100 megatons of sulfur dioxide in the form of pollution into the troposphere. That actually does cool the planet. So we're sort of doing a really poor geoengineering job, if you will, with all of our pollution. So it's a significant amount of material, but it's a relatively small increment on how much pollution we currently dump in there. So it'd be a relatively small increment in acid rain. That's one of the impacts that you have to evaluate.
So that's ineffective.
I don't want to minimize the effects of acid rain and things like that, right? But at the same time, it's like you have to put that in context with, well, if this were to preserve the Arctic and prevent sea level rise, maybe a 10% increase in acid rain is acceptable.
So in effect, it's a 10% increase in the volume of
relative to what we put into the, it's a little bit more complicated because what we put into the troposphere, it doesn't stay very long. It rains out in about a week or so, whereas what you put in the stratosphere stays there for a year or more. That's why you can get away with such smaller amounts. But what we put in the troposphere generally most of it comes down not too far from where we put it up. So if we have, so the air quality impacts and acid rain impacts and so forth are mostly suffered by the same countries that are doing the emissions. Whereas if you're distributing it globally in the stratosphere, where it comes down is much more globally. So it'd be a really tiny increment in acid rain in places that are currently industrial, but it could be a more significant increase in places that are pristine.
Thanks. So just to be exposed a little bit further, so you talked about what drops out of the troposphere. Of course, what's injected in the stratosphere will drop out, but more slowly over time. So whilst you inject 10 megatons, you'll be injecting year on year on year to maintain that level. Can you give a sense to the audience of how much additional injection would be required each year?
Well, so that's that rough estimate would be 10 to 3. So, depends on what your target was. If you're thinking, a lot of the projections right now are suggesting that we're more on track for 3 degrees of warming by the end of the century. And so if you wanted to cool back down to that Paris Agreement notional target of 1.5 degrees, that would be about 15 megatons at the end of the century. And slowly ramping up to that quantity. So and in terms of actually doing it, it's more than a couple of airplanes to do that. But it's a really, really small airline essentially in terms of the actual operations. So it's not something that, a country the size of Fiji, for example, would be able to do by itself. But I think as Ina pointed out, it's the barriers to doing this are probably more about international power than they are about technology.
Okay. Thank you very much. I was just thinking we're coming towards the end of our time now, but I was just, I suppose, thinking about a more of a forward-looking question. And that's really, we've been talking about this for quite a while now, certainly within the academic community. There's been discussion in this space for a good 15 or so years. Are you content with the progress that's been made so far, or would you have preferred to see it accelerating more rapidly? Researchers always want more money and they want it sooner, of course. But in the context of this topic, how do you feel progress is, and what would you like to see happening in the future in the next 5 years or so?
I can speak a little bit on the physical science side. Yeah, it's been talked about for about 15 years, but virtually all of the research has been volunteer, and it's been sort of really idealized things. and there has not been any significant support for research. So in the US right now, there's, I think we're up to 3 single PI NSF awards. And then there's a recent increment in funding for NOAA to do some stratospheric monitoring, basically. So yes, it's been talked about, but there really hasn't been the sort of serious research that you would need to do if you want to really inform people and say, look, here's what we think what would happen, and here's what we don't know.
Can I comment on that question from a different angle? You know,
I was hoping somebody else would fill in the other half of the question.
No, but I'm not going to ask for money for governance research. I'm going to let me start with the proposition that whether it is the research on the science side or the research on the governance side, we are still working without real understanding of how countries are likely to respond. We're just working on hypotheses that under certain circumstances, etc., the way it's framed and so forth, this is how they might or might not act. And we have only history to go back on, right? And that's why I think Ina mentioned there's no blank slate on this. But the proposition I want to make is that even less evolved technologies can have disproportionate political ramifications. Right? Let me give an example from our world of climate and climate mitigation. Okay. 2009, we had effectively a failed climate negotiation summit in Copenhagen. 2015, we had a relatively successful climate negotiation summit in Paris. In that intervening 6 years, 11% of WTO disputes, trade disputes of the World Trade Organization, new disputes that were introduced related to clean energy. Okay. But you don't have to be a trade economist to know that clean energy does not account for 11% of global trade. It doesn't even account for 1% of global trade, right? And we are talking about, countries planting. What are these disputes about? You got to buy my solar panels, or I'm going to impose tariffs against your LED light bulbs. Compared to SAI, completely innocuous, feel-good technologies that we should all be collaborating and cooperating on to try and do the little bit more that we need to do on climate mitigation. And yet, before you even create a large enough market, countries go start planting nationalist flags and mercantilist flags on emerging technologies, right? And this has happened just in the past decade. I'm not talking about any other domain. I'm not talking about pharmaceuticals. I'm not talking about international conflict. I'm talking about trade in solar panels and LED light bulbs. So now imagine that the absence of real research, again, on the scientific side or the governance side, how much we are flying in the blind, right? So I think what is needed even more than the research funding, right, is some real questions that countries would ask formally, about these emerging technologies. What are their concerns? What are they signaling? Are they gung-ho about it? Are they not? So that researchers like us on the science side or the economic side or the political science side would know what we have to actually go and try and answer, right? And because countries are not coming forward and even having a real discussion on this, we are really in a world of conjecture, hypothesis, and perhaps very dangerous, ill-informed actions that would, as again, I think Ina's presentation pointed out, suddenly you undertake it because then it's too late. And that pandemic analogy of the paper, I think that Holly Buck has written and others, is a good one. So, and once those questions are raised by governments, I think the research funding will flow. They'll say, oh, we are interested in how, the Southeast Asia region is going to get impacted in terms of its biodiverse rainforests. Okay, then you might get a research group working out of the Philippines, and collaborating with scientists in the United States doing that specific research. But that question has not been asked.
Yeah, Ina, please. Yeah.
I just want to build on what Arunabha said, because I think it describes the frontier of at least social science research in this field right now. So not only do we not know what governments think about this because they're not asking questions, but also at least not questions on the kinds of terms that we're familiar with, but also we are, as researchers, have done very little empirical research in how these things are actually playing out within a social or political context. So yes, we do a lot of research on potentials and we have hypotheses about what governance might look like and we give advice and so forth, but we don't go into the actual in-depth nitty-gritty conversations that are out there in different fora, maybe using a different kind of terminology, because what we often do is to sort of stay within the terminology, within the scientific terminology of solar radiation management, carbon dioxide removal, stratospheric aerosol injection, the things that basically scientists have put on the table in their various scientific publications. But I think what we need to do at this point is to expand our horizon and think about, okay, what other words are just, maybe it's a little bit of blind searching, but things that are somehow comparable, things where ideas about stratospheric aerosol injection coming in under different terms and in different sort of guises are entering political arenas, and what kind of effects they're having there, and what kind of political actors are involved, what kind of questions they ask. Sometimes this is behind closed doors, so we have no access, but we need to be more in contact with the people who do have access to these arenas where things like this are being negotiated. And I think that is coming up increasingly. So there are instances where ideas about stratospheric aerosol injection or geoengineering technologies are entering the real political world, even if it's just, in the form of small fora and, companies trying to push forward something. We need to find where that is happening. I think that is it's a really big challenge, because there's no website where you can go to and say, oh, look, these are all the different fora where things are happening, and we can just go and research those. But we need to be more in contact with people who are in the negotiations, who are part of environmental ministries in different countries, who might have an idea of what's happening, and also to ask them, to explain to them what we mean using different kinds of terminology. Because the problem is also that the reason why governments are not asking questions about SRM or about SAI is because there's no dedicated responsibility for this kind of technology. The way that ministries are organized is that everybody's working on very small aspects of climate change, and everybody has different responsibilities, but this overarching view on geoengineering or stratospheric aerosol injection is lacking. And there's only very few policymakers who still, go beyond their own competence to think about what geoengineering could mean. So the way that things are organized within ministries also makes it difficult for politicians to even move forward with these kinds of questions.
Absolutely. And joined up government and governance is an extraordinarily challenging problem that's been grappled with for a long time. And I'm not sure how much progress has been made, but it's an enormous challenge, particularly for something like this. I think, Arunabha, were you waving your hand? You wanted to come back in on that? No, okay. I just have this thing that still sits in my mind, which is that we talk about governments should ask substantive, real questions. But quite how we get them to ask those questions and whom they're going to ask the questions of, I find still vague, but that's probably something for another webinar another day. Before we close, I just wondered if you would each like to just reflect a few final thoughts, if you have any, on the conversation, or indeed anything else in this space that we haven't yet touched on that might be of interest.
I think the only thing I might add to all of this is, of course, with climate change, the clock is ticking. And so while, I sort of feel a little bit like we're in February of 2020 right now, and we should be making the best of the time we have, rather than suddenly discovering, rather than suddenly sort of hitting a crisis point and trying to act. because that's sort of the worst possible thing, right? So, there's the ideal world in which we develop good mechanisms and we develop all the information that we need to support informed decisions. And that's what we should be doing our best to encourage that outcome to come about. But if we just sort of sit idly by and wait for governments to come to us for information, for example, it may wind up being too late by the time they ask for that information.
Maybe picking up on what Doug just said, and something that Ina hinted at or said early on in our presentation, and I have also made that point in a different presentation in the series. We can't, of course, keep sitting around waiting for the asteroid to come and hit us. But at the same time, I think you asked Paul a little while earlier, is the research progressing fast enough, or should more be done? I think it's the manner in which research is organized that we need to now think very hard about. Again, using the pandemic analogy, right? Those Ina's used it, Doug has used it, so let me use it. We are entering a world of potential vaccine nationalization, right? Or vaccine nationalism, right? And that need not be the only world we have. We have past history of countries collaborating on, joint drug development. We have history of countries collaborating on new forms of high-yielding varieties of seeds that triggered the Green Revolution. So there is no reason why countries can't be putting together some kind of an international research program that works on climate altering technologies, whether it's carbon dioxide removal or SAI or other forms of solar radiation management. It's the absence of that creates even more uncertainty about intentions, motives, funding, let alone the real questions that we should be asking or answering about consequences, relative gains and losses, risk analysis, right? Those are the forward-looking questions we should be asking, rather than wondering why is X doing something and Y country doing something else. And I think, I have written quite a lot about this, but others have also written. I think there are clear principles on which we can organize international collaborative research programs. And I would make one more strong pitch for it.
Yeah, maybe from my perspective, just a last reflective comment. I think that finding governance for SAI will not be a one-off event in which a decision is made somewhere and then we have a governance mechanism. I think what is happening, what we're already seeing is that the governance process is evolving, maybe not through governmental actors at this point in time, but other actors defining the framework of how we think about things, defining what the problem is, putting out scientific assessments that define the information that is out there. And all of these things, as I was explaining earlier in my presentation, they contribute to defining the problem that will eventually be governed. And I think in this context, having this in mind, I think it's important that we take a wider look at stratospheric aerosol injection and place it in the context of climate change politics more generally. So I think a lot of the research that is out there is focused very narrowly on the individual technology. It does evaluations of what that individual technology would do, what particular governance mechanisms for that individual technology would look like. But I think at this point it is important, and I think it would be also very helpful for government actors and other people involved in the actual decision-making process is to link that up with the climate change more generally, and also ask ourselves a little bit, where is the idea of stratospheric aerosol injection coming from? What is it as a result of? And here, I think we require a bit more, let's say, critical social science research on the way that we conceptualize the climate as a manageable object, and therefore sort of has SAI as a possibility to manage that climate. So there's a lot of just, opening up the box a little bit, rethinking things, seeing things from a different perspective. I think that would be helpful in bringing the discussion forwards.
Thank you all very much indeed for the presentations beforehand and the fascinating conversation. It's an extraordinary topic with the most stimulating depth, and it's something that's going to be discussed for many years to come yet, I believe, and I hope, because we do need to have a fulsome conversation about this. And by we, that generally does, I believe, mean as many people globally as possible before we ever come to any view about how we move forward. So with that, I'm going to say thank you very much to everyone again, and invite participants to have a look at other events that are on our website, and look forward to other events coming forward. And at that point, thank you again, and close the session.